verses 2 through 8 and 22 through 26. There, James, in writing to his church for which he is a pastor, says, "My brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you is lacking in wisdom, ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to you. But ask in faith, never doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the doubter, being double-minded and unstable in every way, must not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves and, on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And indeed, I am inviting Ron Campbell to come up here and to join me in a conversation today. It is so wonderful to be with you, Ron, and to have Barbara here with you as well. And I think you've been here to our church a couple of times previously. And I know that I've been to your church, which is the Holy and Whole Ministries that Pastor Michelle Thomas is the pastor of. And as I was trying to think, we've known each other just about 2 or 3 years, but I think we might have met there at your church at least one of the first times.
I think we did. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for having this conversation.
Sure.
And not that it is courageous, I think it's right, and it's fair, and it's just. Yes, we have been here many times, we've been welcome, and so absolutely, it's a pleasure to be back. But I do believe that's how we first had a connection.
It's kind of interesting, we just kind of had a nice meeting there, but I know that we've had some times to sit down together and do things together. Pastor Michelle is always getting me to do things, and I think if she's getting me to do things, it's just a drop in the bucket compared to how she gets you to do things. But one of the first things I remember was going to a cemetery for the enslaved that she was trying to get the property for, and we had to go way back in this road behind where the Walmart is now in Leesburg, and you wouldn't go past a certain line because you're on the Leesburg Town Council, and you said, "This is not legal for me to do." And so you showed a sense of where our appropriate boundaries and respected that, even though I didn't, I suppose. But right. I remember that being kind of a symbol to me of a little bit of your integrity and who you are, and I appreciated that.
Well, thank you.
And we've also had a little bit of time where actually I'm still trying to cook up a trip to Israel and Palestine, and I know we've had some good conversations about that. So we are here today, and I am hopeful that we can have a kind of an interesting conversation that might be a model for our congregation to have about race and racism. And I especially wanted to have you, Ron, because one of the things that's been important is, I know you are such a gifted and resourceful person, just many, many wonderful things coming out from you as I know you. Back in time, I don't know if you know this yourself, but when the Berlin Wall fell and there were protests in Tiananmen Square, some of the kind of conversation that we're having about race and racism was present there because they sang the song "We Shall Overcome." So here's a kind of a theme song of trying to get past race and racism issues in our own country, and it's so powerful that it gets contagious even to places of dramatic change in the world, and that's because Black Americans, I think, have persevered through horrible violence and oppression, and I know that's true. And I know that's why one of the things that you're doing in the Loudon Freedom Center is you go to these cemeteries to kind of honor people who were really overlooked and to say what value they've had. What's the story that you have yourself of resilience and hope that has been a way for you to live out of that kind of goodness and freedom?
Well, let me quickly reflect on what you've said about history, because I think this isn't new. As we look at people and communities coming together, looking at healing, looking at reconciliation, looking at this whole evolution of how we as a people better partner to worship, live, play on this particular planet. And my wife and I have been privileged to do a lot of traveling, and we actually witnessed the religious harassment of the Falun Gong one day when we were not casually standing in Tiananmen Square, but in Tiananmen Square.
Okay, wow.
But not purposely for that. But understanding people, culture, and their histories about why certain oppressions exist, and even under different governmental rules, there is a spirit about faith. We stood in Nelson Mandela's prison cell, and we witnessed what faith can do, not just for healing of an individual at a particular time, but the strength and courage then to come out and lead a country through reconciliation, and not just about retaliation for hate or for harm. And now having these types of conversations, to me, is almost a little late, but and I'll explain what I mean late, because they've been ongoing since the beginning of slavery, and they were called abolitionists. Right. But a personal story, back in June, my wife and I met when we were in Minnesota, and obviously with the recent events with George Floyd in Minneapolis, and she has still family there, very personal for us. And I've known my mother-in-law, who just happens to be Presbyterian, for over 23, almost 24 years.
Does she live in Minneapolis?
She lives in Minneapolis, downtown Minneapolis, and she could.
I think I might know her church. I know the downtown church there.
Yeah, the big one downtown.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I have some friends that are members there too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Radicals. But
yes.
she could see and feel the fire and the smoke and the pain, but her heart was touched in a way that she never had. I'm just going to read a little bit for you to understand what I believe how we can do better. Dear Ron and Barb, with all the protests, peaceful and not, I've been thinking a lot about my privileged white life. We never asked for this. She offered this. I have rushed to judgment too many times, including you, Ron, because of the color of your skin. I want and need to apologize for that. To know you, your caring ways, your love, your goodness far overshadows the color of your skin. And again, I apologize. Forgive me for being a privileged white person who judges without knowing. I'm sorry it's taken the protest, death of another black man for me to face up to my weakness. Please forgive me. Okay. I mean, a move now is moved then. We've had difficult conversations over these last many years. Never of them resulted in hostility, sometimes just resulted in two stubborn people not moving forward. But something touched her, whether it was her faith, her compassion. I refuse to believe that I'm that good where she would offer this. But at the same time, this is the era I think that we're living in now, of these difficult conversations, people coming together, and then facing what we all want at the end of the day: love, kindness, forgiveness, hope. Right.
And I kind of was, as I knew that you were going to share this story about your mother-in-law and the very generous and loving apology that she extended to you. I think it's so powerful to hear what she wrote to you and to Barbara too. I really appreciate you sharing that. But I think that, there's something in what she was saying that is the challenging thing for those of us who are white, because I think we get to some sense of saying there is no problem. What's a problem? And that's because we don't see things very clearly. We see things from our perspective, we have blinders on. I was just thinking back, myself and growing up about when did race become something I was aware of? And as I reflect back, I was born in Peoria, Illinois, because we were a little bit downstate in Illinois. My dad was a St. Louis Cardinals fan, not a Cubs fan. And so I grew up liking the St. Louis Cardinals. And my three favorite players were Lou Brock, Curt Flood, and Bob Gibson, all African-American players. And I loved playing baseball. I'd throw a wiffle ball up and I'd hit it with a plastic bat in the front yard, and I'd try to hit it so I hit it up in the air and I could go catch it, you know.
Right.
And I would pretend I was one of the St. Louis Cardinals. And I remember saying, I'm Curt Flood, and then going, well, how can I be Curt Flood? I'm not black. And I'm like, I was conscious of this conversation going on in my head as a 6 or 7-year-old kid, and I was like, and where did that come from?
But at the same time, growing up in the Bronx and being a Yankees fan,
Yeah.
I idolized Mickey Mantle.
Okay.
The white kids would say, well, you can't
Right.
because he's white.
Right.
Yet I'm idolizing a baseball player. You know, I was supposed to, I guess, go after the only black catcher, who was Elston Howard at that particular time,
Right.
rather than be Mickey Mantle.
Yeah.
So we both had these challenges of dynamics, but where did that come from?
Right. It's not in the water. It really came from somebody telling us, you know. And that's the thing where I think we have that kind of set of blinders on. We don't see it. And so I think it's something we push down. And I hear that in what your mother-in-law is writing to you, that there's some kind of similar dynamic, and she's seeing it. Maybe the George Floyd thing in Minneapolis has brought her awareness up. And I think there's something valuable about that kind of new awareness that's coming.
Right. Well, the awareness that I'm hearing, and this is where we have to get back, and it isn't the black and white, it's who teaches us and what we believe. Mm-hmm. Whether it's what we think our faith teaches us, our community teaches us, who teaches us how to be a man. And we think about relationships and experiences. And that's what I'm hoping conversations will start to reveal, how we've learned what we've learned. And then, then what do we do with that when we may have to reject some of it because it's been incorrect or history hasn't been taught so we could recognize completeness. But people have to do that kind of soul searching. I actually brought another little pamphlet that I had a chance to look at this week. And this was written by a black preacher in 1925. And he reveals two things that I'm hoping that people would take a look at. The first registrar of vital statistics of Virginia was a gentleman named Dr. I think it's W.A. Plecker. And he was the registrar of vital statistics. And he advocated what is called the suicidal philosophy of race hate, even against the plain teaching of the Bible. He says, let us turn a deaf ear to those who would interpret Christian brotherhood to mean racial equality. And this particular statement was written in 1924, and he was a registrar from 1922 to 1947. Now imagine, and he was also a leader in a white supremacist organization in Richmond. Imagine then what history and what information and what data is going to be skewed. So on one hand, I want people to have a heart. Others, I want them to have a head and really listen intellectually about how we've learned and who we've learned it from and the kind of sources. But this was being challenged by a black preacher whose church organization I later became a part of, which is why I have the pamphlet, in 1925 that talks about our spiritual kinship and our brotherhood through the lineage of Jesus Christ and the death and burial and resurrection, that our blood and our faith became mixed. And so we are all one if we believe in the scriptures.
Right.
I mean, and that's our foundation of hope for me, that we can have difficult conversations and then get back to our kinship and then understand the privilege that we're not living, not as white, but as Christians.
Well, I know one of the things the book of James says, and we'll read this, I believe, next Sunday, is that, we should not make distinctions. And he talks about, somebody coming to worship And puts it in terms of poor and rich. And he said, when the poor man comes in and you make him say, sit here at my feet, and the rich man comes in and you say, here, sit in this seat right here,
right,
and have a privileged spot. He says, you're making distinctions, and that's not who Jesus is. Jesus doesn't lead us to bring those kinds of distinctions to things so that we have a sense of a hierarchy or a favoritism that goes to some and others are put down at a kind of different level of things. So
right.
I think that's one of the things, and we see that happening not just in our individual kind of attitudes or the like, but it gets embodied in our culture and in our laws and in systems of how things go. And I think that's partly why this conversation is so important, because those kinds of attitudes are now habitual and actually embedded into many kinds of ways that we've arranged ourselves as a society. And that's a part of what I think our discussion is going to be about. Eventually,
right,
in this series, we're going to have at the end of it Phyllis Randall, our Board of Supervisors chair, and Chief Cynthia McAllister, who is our Percival Police Chief, and we're going to have them come and have this kind of conversation on a Sunday morning. And I hope it'll be really beneficial, because sometimes those things get so put down into our social systems of things that's what continues to perpetuate a lot of things that are needing to change today.
Well, I think people will start to have these conversations and start to understand different words that are being tossed out there, like systemic racism.
Right.
And what we just talked about is the embeddedness, and that's what systemic racism is about. How it affects our culture, our learning, our history, our education, our systems, our policies and procedures. Not that, again, and this is the fear I think some people have, is that I'm going to be identified as being a racist versus identifying the system that I'm living in and the privilege that I'm living with allows that systemic racism to continue if it's not challenged. And so some of these conversations may be difficult, not in the sense of personally identifying. Some of them might be, but they also might be that we have to change how we vote, change how we look at a challenge of racial profiling in law enforcement and what that's all about, and to be able to be open enough, I think, to share and ask questions. But then there's also the challenge, and we've talked about this, and this is these conversations as well. So who do you believe? Do you believe me? Do you believe yourself? Do you believe other sources? How do we have some conversations where there's some level of authority that helps us trust?
I think the passage from James today had, really important verse in it, which is, any of you who are lacking in wisdom are to ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly. And I like that sense of, well, wisdom to me is kind of taking those experiences and not just being smart about it, but learning from our failures.
Right.
And saying, okay, I needed a little bit different understanding of things, and I need to do differently going forward. But also the way that the passage talks about God having a spirit of generosity, and about how God is ungrudging in helping us to have the opportunity to change some of the things that we need, that wisdom would teach us.
It's also not a one-sided conversation, right? I almost had to learn to like white people in the sense of what I was taught and what I experienced. And I was born in 1953, and I saw some very bad things, experienced some things, and lived through some evolution of some things. I was more on the side of being a Black Panther because advocating not for violence, but for rights. My father was in the civil rights movement, as well as others that I knew, and we were standing very strong about our identity. I lived to go from being a colored person, a Negro, to being a proud Black person, to becoming an African American, and now I'm an American of African descent. So we continue to evolve because that's what unifies us in this country, right? We're Americans, and we need to have that conversation. So I don't care if you're of Italian descent, Irish descent. I don't care about the ethnicity as a self-identification. I care about it as a source of pride and understanding my culture and what I value in my culture. And we all should value each other's cultures as Americans.
One of the things.
So how do we have these conversations? Because they're not just an hour.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, so our conversation that we hope people will sign up for small groups is it's the tip of an iceberg, but it's a an intentional attempt at trying to start having these conversations. One of the things I wanted to ask Ron for you to do is, I think sometimes African American community looked at as being, struggling and facing all kinds of difficulties, poverty and segregation, and so there's so many things to overcome that and people have white people oftentimes will be fearful about even going into a black neighborhood or things like that that are there actually because of systemic laws in the 1940s and 50s that kind of helped segregate African American people into certain places. But the one thing I think is really helpful is to hear, what are the strengths that I know you have from your family. One of the things you were telling me about earlier as we prepared for today was about your grandfather and kind of the things that you got from your grandfather that kind of that helps you to be that strong person today, to be a resilient person, but also a person who has a lot of things to offer that are wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about your grandfather and what he meant to you?
My grandfather was a bishop in a very apostolic Pentecostal church in Florida, and while we grew up in New York, I spent the first 14 summers going to Florida, and basically I learned to read by reading the Bible, the old King James Version, because I would read for him as he preached. But he was also a Mason, and he built churches, literally built churches. He was a standout of his community. He was the first African-American entrepreneur that I knew. And so I've got nothing but a sense of can-do, pride, a responsibility, not just to myself, but to my community and how we volunteered. And so when we went back to New York, and I think this is where my mother and father got it from, and my mother was she was the second of 13 children that they had, and that we're always going to participate. We're always going to, a sense of self-esteem and a sense of strength of having your voice heard, and even listening to him as a preacher as he traveled around, and the respect that he generated. I understood that my voice was not to be taken lightly, that it can impact and change people's lives, no matter how I felt about myself and my readiness to, and trust me, I was not ready to get elected to any office in Leesburg or any place else, but there's a responsibility that I learned from my grandfather, and he also grew up in, again, this type of organization, but the prayers they prayed were for people to come together, not just for healing, not just for coming out of strife or misery, but they saw a much broader, bigger picture about the world and the faith community. And before we close, I want to read, again, an excerpt of a prayer that was written at the back of this book in 1925 that is just as relevant today as it was in 1925. So my grandfather was the first powerful black man I ever met. My dad was the strongest because he had to discipline me.
Well, why don't you share that prayer, and
Okay.
we'll close with that
Right.
one. Thank you so much.
This fly stuff's bothering me. It says, prayer for freedom from race prejudice. O God, who has made man in thine own likeness, and who doth love all whom thou hast made, suffer us not because of the difference of race, color, or condition to separate ourselves from others and thereby from thee. But teach us the unity of thy family, the universality of thy love, as thou, Savior, as a son was born of a Hebrew mother who had the blood of many nations in her veins, and ministered first to thy brethren of the Israels, but rejoiced in the faith of a Syro-Phoenician woman and of a Roman soldier, and suffered your cross to be carried by Ethiopian. Teach us also, while loving and serving our own, to enter into the communion of the whole humanity, and forbid that from pride of birth, color, achievement, and hardness of heart, we should despise any for whom Christ died.
Amen. Amen. Thank you very much, Ron, for coming and being able to have this kind of conversation with me today.
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate it. And I hope that our congregation members are encouraged to participate in these conversations coming up over the next 4 weeks. So thank you. And I'm hoping that some people are sending in their prayer concerns for the day and joys. And as you do, Bonnie is going to come up and share those with us, and we'll keep them in our prayers as we look forward to communion in just a moment.